to page K1. K1. The respiratory system. We're going to see that the first third of the respiratory system in large measure pertains to stuff we've already talked about. So I'm going to go through it quickly. But before we do, first, what are the functions of the respiratory system? Well, obviously, in goes the good air, out goes the bad air. And the reason why you need the good air, you need the oxygen. And what's the bad air? Carbon dioxide. And of course, why you need the oxygen and where carbon dioxide came from are both related to the same thing, cellular respiration. Right? You use oxygen for cellular respiration to make ATP, and carbon dioxide is a waste product generated in cellular respiration as you make ATP. Now, the process of taking in the good air and exhaling the bad air is known as pulmonary ventilation or external respiration. So pulmonary ventilation is the name we give. I mean, what does pulmonary mean? Lung. So ventilation means, you know, in goes the good air, out goes the bad air. Now, a second function of our respiratory system is vocalization. And that's because your vocal cords in your larynx are part of your respiratory system. And the third function of the respiratory system is olfaction. And that's the sense of smell. All right, now we're going to divide the respiratory system into different regions, just as we did with the digestive system and the kidneys. Remember, with the alimentary canal, we talked about how food moves through the alimentary canal. Remember that? It goes from the oral cavity, oropharynx, laryngopharynx, and down the esophagus to the stomach, to the duodenum, jejunum, ileum, cecum, ascending colon, transverse colon, descending colon, sigmoid colon, rectum, and anus. We've talked about the regions of the urinary system, the kidneys, the ureter, urinary bladder, urethral canal. We've talked about the parts of the nephron, and we're going to talk about the parts of the respiratory system, the nasal cavities, the pharynx. What's the pharynx? Throat. The larynx, that's the voice box. The trachea, that's the windpipe. And the lungs. Now, when I tell you that, of course, the trachea is the windpipe or the larynx is the voice box, those are the common names. I'm not asking you for the common names. We want the technical names. But let's start with the nasal cavities. So first of all, we remind you that in terms of the nose, there are the anterior nares or nostrils right at the front. We've also learned that there are the posterior nares or choanae at the back of the nasal cavities. The front of your nose is made up of cartilage, right? These are called nasal cartilages. Right? That's why you can move your nose. Your nose is not bone in the front, it's cartilage. The only part that's bone is right here, the nasal bones, right at the top. Right? That's the bridge of the nose, the top of the nose are bones. On the next page, K2. On K2, so rhinitis. Well, rhino means nose. So rhinitis is an infection in the nose. In other words, it's actually the clinical word for cold. A cold is called rhinitis. What are the olfactory receptors? Well, we've talked about this before. We've learned that on K2 previously there are these olfactory nerves, and they pass up through the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. You'd say, well, say that again? It's written right here. Cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. And they go right through the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone to your brain. That's how those olfactory nerves are connected to your brain. Lower down on the page, the nasolacrimal aperture. Yeah, we've talked about that before. we know that the tears are carried from the medial corner of your eye through this nasolacrimal canal that allows the tears to come out your nose. And this opening, the opening is called the nasolacrimal aperture, is the opening. So here it says orifice of nasolacrimal duct, in other words, the nasolacrimal aperture. An aperture is an opening. And we've explained that's why when you're tearing, when you're crying, your nose starts to run. Your nose starts to run. On page K3, on page K3, the nasal septum. What does the word septum mean? Wall. So the wall between your nasal cavities is called the nasal septum. The conchi. What the heck are the conchi? Remember the conchi? Yeah. Those are the good. Those are those turbinates. You have a nice picture of that. Is if you look, we'll make a note to see page K10. And all right, see K10. There are many pictures we've seen before, but on K10. This is page K10. Those are the superior, middle, and inferior nasal conchi, those ridges. The word conchi actually means shelf, but these are like shelves or ridges on the sides of the nose. Okay, back where we were on K3, the paranasal air sinuses. Ever talked about those before? Yeah, originally we talked about the paranasal sinuses on pages E3 and E4. You might remember when we learned that originally, that I'll just remind you, remember this picture? The paranasal sinuses. The purpose of the sinus cavities is so that when you inhale air through your nose, the air enters into these mucus, these ciliated mucus. Let me start again. When you inhale air through your nose, the air flows into these sinus cavities that are lined by a ciliated mucus membrane that warms and humidifies the air. And we wrote that on E3. On E3 it said that. So on page K3 where we were, if we look in the bottom picture, you can see the arrows indicating how air in the nasal cavity can flow into the frontal sinus, and it can flow into the sphenoid sinus. Right? So these are lined by a ciliated mucous membrane. And if these sinus cavities, this is the sphenoidal sinus and the frontal paranasal sinus, if they become infected, that's called sinusitis, or a sinus infection. The choanae, or posterior nares, those are the openings at the back of your nasal cavities where the air flows into your nasal pharynx. We talked about this previously on I think it was J14. Let's see if it was J14. Yeah, it was J14. On J14, we talked about this page J14. We talked about right here the right and left posterior nares, or choanae, allows the air to go from your nasal cavities into the nasal pharynx. So that was back on J14. Okay, in this picture on K3, what else do we see? We see that on the back wall of the nasopharynx, there is a pharyngeal tonsil. If the pharyngeal tonsil becomes enlarged, that's called adenoids. That's an enlarged pharyngeal tonsil. adenoids. And we also see the opening into the auditory tubes, or eustachian canals. Now, we've talked about the auditory tubes or eustachian canals several times. We talked about them, well, let's, wait a second, let's look on page K4. On K4, let's go to K4. On K4, so the pharynx. The pharynx, we know, is divided into an upper, middle, and lower part. The nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. Again, we originally talked about this on J14. The eustachian canals are auditory tubes. We originally talked about them on pages E4 and E5. And more recently on J14. What's the clinical name for an earache? Otitis media. Did we ever give you that before? Yeah. Yep. Twice, both on E5 and on J14. The pharyngeal tonsil, if it's enlarged, it's called adenoids.
Is that the one that you remove?
Well, they will remove the palatine tonsils on the sides of your mouth, and the pharyngeal tonsil or adenoids at the back wall of your nasopharynx.
So both.
Yeah, I don't have either one.
I
Yeah. The only one they didn't remove are the lingual tonsil on the back surface of your tongue. Right? And we talked about all these tonsils back in section J. If you have a sore throat, that's called pharyngitis. Pharyngitis, sore throat. The lower part of the throat is, or pharynx, is called the laryngopharynx. We've talked about all this, the three parts of the pharynx back on J14. So I strongly recommend you go back and review that. On page K5. Yep.
The last structure, if you compare like the digestive to respiratory, which is the pharynx the last thing that, what do you call it, the last structure that will be shared together, the digestive?
Yeah, let's look on K4. On K4, so you had on this picture on K4. This is exactly the same identical picture, just smaller, that appeared on J15. So you can go back and review J15, which is a picture you should know, J15. So we had learned here at J15, we had talked about the nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. So yeah, the part that you're asking, the part that the digestive and respiratory systems share are the oropharynx and laryngopharynx.
Okay.
At the laryngopharynx is where they separate,
Oh, I see.
where the food goes down the esophagus, but the air goes down through the larynx and the trachea. On K5, on K5, we've seen this picture before. You might say, I don't even know what the hell this is. This is that view of the back of somebody's neck where they made an incision and they spread open their neck on the back side to see the throat from the back. You had a picture just like this, just larger, on page J16. On J16. And so the point of this picture is that this is the passageway that air goes. Air goes from the throat, or laryngopharynx, through this opening called the laryngeal aperture down into the larynx. So the opening through which air enters the larynx is called the laryngeal aperture. What does the word aperture mean? Good, excellent. Opening. That's what an aperture is, an opening. An opening to the larynx. I don't know if anybody's noticed, I've included endoscopy videos on YouTube where you can watch them actually go down into the larynx. We'll take a look at that in a moment. On K6, the larynx. All right, now up till now I went through all this stuff pretty quickly because we had already covered the pharynx. Right, I kept referring you to pages we'd already dealt with this stuff. Here's where we'll spend a little bit more time, the larynx. The larynx is also commonly known as the Adam's apple. Of course, if we ask you, we use the word larynx, we don't use the word Adam's apple. Sometimes people will say, well, women don't have an Adam's apple. Well, women have a larynx just like guys have a larynx. They certainly know how to talk. The larynx is larger in a man than in a woman, and as a result, the voice is deeper because the larynx is larger. That's the effect of testosterone. So in a woman, the larynx, or the Adam's apple, is smaller. So the voice is higher. The larynx is lined by non-keratinizing stratified squamous epithelium, which is the same tissue that lines the inside of the oral cavity. It lines the oropharynx and laryngopharynx, and it lines the larynx. What do we call the opening into the larynx? The laryngeal aperture. Here it is right here in this picture. Laryngeal aperture. This is laryngeal aperture. The opening into the larynx. And this cavity of the larynx is called the ventricle of the larynx. You'd say, what? This is called the ventricle of the larynx. This whole chamber. So the chamber where the vocal cords are is called the ventricle. Now you might say, wait a second, the ventricle is in the heart. The word ventricle means chamber. So you have ventricles or chambers in your heart. There are actually fluid-filled chambers or ventricles in your brain. And this is called the ventricle of the larynx, the chamber of the larynx. Now way down there, these are the vocal cords right here. These are the vocal cords. What I'm coloring in red are the vocal cords. These are the vocal cords. Now the slit between the vocal cords is called the glottis. Did we ever learn that? Yeah, we did. That's the slit between the vocal cords. So the air has to go through that slit. All right, so there are the vocal cords and that slit called the glottis. Now, the larynx is made up of 3 large single cartilages. And you might say, like, I don't know what he's talking about. Why don't you feel your larynx? Okay, can you feel that bulge right there? It's hard, but it's not bone. It's cartilage. It's hyaline cartilage. And there are 3 cartilages that form that larynx. There is the epiglottis, the thyroid cartilage, which is the biggest. That's the biggest one, thyroid cartilage. And on the next page, on K7, there is, below the picture, the cricoid cartilage. Now, a good picture is on K7. All right, so on this picture, this is the thyroid cartilage. That's what you're feeling when you felt that bump, that bulge on your neck. That's this thing right here. It's called the thyroid cartilage. And if you're wondering, like, why is it called thyroid cartilage? Because your thyroid gland is found right here, right where my fingers are. That'd be the thyroid gland, right there, on both sides of it. So it's called the thyroid cartilage. Now, the prominent, the part right here on the front sticks out forward, and that part that sticks out forward is called the laryngeal prominence, right? So the part that's just sticking forward. It's called the laryngeal prominence. You'll also notice there's a notch at the very top called the superior thyroid notch. Now, there is another hyaline cartilage right below the large thyroid cartilage. This one's called the cricoid cartilage. You were asked to find these on the cat. Anybody spot them on the cat? Because you can see them on the cat. You have a chance on Wednesday, but you can see them on the cat. Now, the hyaline cartilage is below the cricoid. These are the cartilages of the trachea. All right, so these are the hyaline cartilages of the trachea. But this is the cricoid, this is the large thyroid, and there's also the epiglottis right up here. The epiglottis cartilage. Also notice that right here, this is the hyoid bone. This is the hyoid bone. Now, as you know, I primarily in this class emphasize using the cat. And I don't use a lot of models. There are some anatomy teachers that use a lot of models. I don't. But this is probably a model worth looking at. In fact, on the video, I have a video where I even show this. This is really just like the picture we've just shown you. This is the thyroid cartilage. Here's that laryngeal prominence. Here's the thyroid notch, superior thyroid notch. This is the cricoid cartilage right here. And there's the hyaline cartilage of the trachea. And right up here, this is the hyoid bone, and this is the epiglottis. And if you look inside, and I'll kind of pan this around the room, you'll notice where you can see the slit, the glottis slit between the vocal cords. See that? I'm opening and closing that slit. You see that? And those are the vocal cords that I'm moving. And the opening between them is called the glottis slit. And then this thing is the epiglottis. So the epiglottis can bend down and prevent the food from going into the larynx. Did we ever talk about that?